The sharp scrape of chalk against the blackboard pierced the air, and the classroom fell silent. Everyone knew what was coming. Mr. Dawson, the art teacher, was already pacing in front of his desk, his eyes scanning the room, settling for a moment on David. David's canvas sat quietly on the easel in front of him, a large piece filled with abstract colors, shapes, and an emotion that spilled out of every stroke. David, a lanky 16-year-old with skin the color of mahogany, felt the weight of the room's stare. The thick scent of acrylic still lingered in the air, mingling with the tension. It wasn't the first time Mr. Dawson had scrutinized his work, but it was the first time David could feel something more underneath the surface, something bitter, something unfair. "David," Mr. Dawson began, his voice cool but sharp, "can you explain this nonsense? Is this supposed to be art?" David's heart raced. His painting had taken weeks of practice, patience, and passion. Every brushstroke had been intentional, telling a story, one about his struggles, his identity, his world. But Mr. Dawson didn't see that. To him, it was nothing more than a mess of colors. The class watched in a heavy silence, some of them shifting uncomfortably, others barely containing their smirks. David opened his mouth to speak but faltered, not because he lacked words, but because he had learned a long time ago that his voice often fell on deaf ears. The truth was that in this classroom, in this school, David had never been more than the token black kid, a label that was never spoken but was woven into every interaction, every glance, every critique. Mr. Dawson's sneer grew more pronounced as he continued to circle the easel. "You've spent hours on this, and this is what you've produced. I don't see any effort, no real talent, no understanding of technique. This is just chaotic." David's face burned. His classmates looked between him and Mr. Dawson, and he knew that none of them would challenge their teacher. No one ever did. Not when it came to Mr. Dawson. He glanced at his work again. The deep red swirls in the corner, the fractured lines that represented fractured experiences. The golden streaks that symbolized the small moments of joy he fought to hold on to in the face of adversity. It was his life on that canvas, and yet Mr. Dawson saw none of it. But just as David was about to speak, something in the corner of his eye caught his attention. The class had been silent long enough for David to notice that one student, a girl named Lily, was sitting with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, her usual aloofness replaced with something else. Was that anger? Lily was an enigma to David, a white girl who had never quite fit in with the rest of the student body. She was artistic, yes, but she had always kept her distance, never engaging with anyone beyond surface-level conversations. David had always suspected she saw through the veil that people like Mr. Dawson often hid behind, but he had never expected her to step in. With a sharp inhale, Lily stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her voice broke through the silence, calm but firm. "Mr. Dawson, maybe you're the one who doesn't understand." The room collectively froze. David's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen Lily challenge anyone like this, certainly not a teacher. Mr. Dawson, visibly taken aback, sneered. "Excuse me, Miss Montgomery." Lily didn't back down. "You're criticizing David's work because it doesn't fit into your narrow definition of art. What you're really saying is that it doesn't fit into your definition of what a black person's art should look like. You're blinded by your own biases." David's chest tightened. He hadn't expected this. He had never expected Lily to speak out against Mr. Dawson, not when it was so much easier to blend in and stay silent. But there it was. The truth, raw and unfiltered, laid bare. "You think this is chaotic?" Lily continued, her voice rising, "Maybe it's chaotic because that's how the world feels when you're told from the moment you're born that you don't matter. You see nothing but noise and confusion, and then you create something out of it to make sense of it. David's work tells a story that you and most people here can't or won't see." Mr. Dawson's face reddened, and for a moment, there was a dangerous flicker in his eyes. But Lily wasn't finished. "It's easier to tear someone down, isn't it? Easier than actually understanding their experience. Easier than acknowledging that your privilege blinds you to the realities others face every single day. You don't even see the art in front of you, because you don't want to. There was a long silence after Lily's words hung in the air, thick with meaning. David's heart pounded in his chest, but there was also something else, a sense of power, a sense of dignity that had been absent before. For once, someone had spoken up for him. For once, someone had seen him. Mr. Dawson sputtered, caught off guard by the audacity of the challenge. He began, but Lily interrupted him. No, Mr. Dawson, Lily said, voice steady now. This isn't about technique. This isn't about the art world standards. It's about you holding on to the power of your position and using it to silence someone who doesn't look like you. David felt his throat tighten as he stood there, rooted to the spot. He wanted to speak. He wanted to thank Lily, to tell her that he had been invisible in this place for too long, but the words got caught in his chest. He wasn't sure how to express what had been building for so long, the quiet hurt, the anger, the feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, and never seen. But Lily's words had broken through. They had given him a voice, even if he wasn't quite ready to use it yet. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but the atmosphere was heavy, thick with the aftermath of a confrontation that no one had expected. As students filtered out, whispers filled the air, some of approval, others of shock. David felt all eyes on him as he gathered his things, but this time, it didn't matter. Lily came up to him as he was about to leave. She didn't say anything at first, just gave him a small, knowing smile. He returned it, unsure of what to say. You're not alone in this, David, she said quietly, you never were. David nodded, the weight on his shoulders lifting just a little. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. He felt like he mattered. The hallways buzzed with the usual noise of students rushing between classes, but today, the sound felt distant. David walked with his head held a little higher, though his thoughts still swirled like the colors in his painting. His footsteps echoed in the long corridor, but instead of feeling isolated, he felt something different, strength. It was as if Lily's words had ignited a spark that couldn't be easily extinguished. As he turned the corner, he spotted Mr. Dawson standing by the teacher's lounge, speaking with another faculty member. Their conversation paused as they saw David approach. Mr. Dawson's eyes briefly flicked to him, but he didn't say anything. The way David held his gaze, unflinching, spoke volumes. For the first time, David wasn't the one to look away. He passed by them without a word, but the shift in power was palpable. He wasn't going to let himself be silenced anymore, not by teachers, not by classmates, and definitely not by a system that tried to place him in a box he didn't fit in. Later that afternoon, David found himself sitting in the quiet of the school library, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The tension from earlier in the day had settled, but the weight of everything, the years of underestimation, the quiet rejection, still lingered in his chest. He opened his sketchbook and began to draw. His hand moved with confidence, strokes flowing across the page as the emotions he'd kept bottled up for so long poured out. Each line he sketched was a defiance, a refusal to be invisible. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Lily. I hope you're okay. If you need anything, I'm here. You deserve to have your work seen and respected. David stared at the message for a moment. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. In a world where people like him were often overlooked, where his voice was drowned out by others' assumptions, Lily had given him something rare, acknowledgement. And that alone was enough to keep him going. The following days passed in a blur. Word about the confrontation in class spread through the school like wildfire. At first, there were whispers behind his back, some curious, some judgmental. But David didn't care. He held his ground, kept his head up, and continued creating, pouring his soul into each brushstroke and sketch. His art began to tell a new story, one where he wasn't just the misunderstood teenager sitting in the back of the class. He was the artist, the creator, the one who would no longer let anyone define him. The real turning point came a week later, when the school principal, Mrs. Harmon, called David to her office. His stomach churned as he walked down the familiar hallway, the sound of his sneakers clicking against the floor a rhythmic reminder of the battle he'd been fighting silently for so long. When he entered her office, Mrs. Harmon was sitting behind her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She gestured for him to sit. "David," she began, her voice warm but serious, "I've heard a lot about the incident in Mr. Dawson's class. I wanted to check in with you, see how you're doing." David wasn't sure how to respond. Was she asking as a principal, or as someone who had heard the rumors? The line between genuine concern and institutional protocol was always blurry, especially when it came to students like him. But then he remembered Lily's words, "You're not alone in this." "I'm doing fine," David replied, his voice steady. "But I need to say this. What happened with Mr. Dawson, it wasn't just about art. It was about respect. For me, for who I am, and for what I bring to the table. His critique wasn't just about my work, it was about my identity." Mrs. Harmon studied him for a moment, and then nodded slowly. "I understand. And you're right. We, as a school, need to do better. We need to provide a space where all students, no matter their background, feel valued." David wasn't sure if he believed her, but he appreciated the sincerity in her voice. It was the first time anyone in authority had acknowledged the deeper issue that had been simmering beneath the surface. She continued, "I want to encourage you to keep pursuing your art. Your voice matters, David. And I'll make sure Mr. Dawson is aware of the concerns you raised. This situation needs to be addressed." David stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation slowly lifting off his shoulders. For once, it wasn't about him being silenced or overlooked. He was being heard. He was being seen. As he left Mrs. Harmon's office, he felt lighter than he had in years. He knew there was still a long way to go, but today, he had taken the first step towards something bigger than just one painting, one class, one confrontation. This was about carving out space for himself, space where his story, his truth, could exist without apology. The next week, when the art showcase came around, David's painting was placed front and center in the display. It was no longer just a chaotic swirl of colors. It was a symbol of resistance, of the power of art to break barriers and challenge perceptions. And as he stood in front of it, watching people stop, stare, and actually see it for what it was, not just the work of a young, misunderstood artist, but a story of a life lived in defiance of erasure, David felt a quiet triumph. In that moment, he realized that his art was never just about the colors on the canvas. It was about the space he was making for himself in a world that had tried to silence him. And with that realization, the pieces of his world began to fall into place, one brushstroke at a time. The night of the art showcase arrived, and the gymnasium was filled with a buzz of excited voices. Parents, teachers, and students milled about, admiring the different pieces on display. The walls were lined with portraits, still lives, and landscapes. Each artist's story captured in hues and textures. But David's painting, bold and unapologetic, stood apart. As he approached the display, he noticed a small crowd gathered around it. His heart quickened, and for a moment, he felt like he was standing outside himself, watching from a distance. The colors of his painting seemed to pulse under the bright lights, as though they were alive, drawing people in. And they were. People were looking at it. Really looking at it, not just skimming over it or nodding politely. "Is this yours?" a voice asked, pulling David back to the present. He turned to find Mrs. Harmon standing next to him, a soft smile on her face. She had been one of the few who had truly listened, and now, she was giving him a space to shine. "Yeah," David said, his voice a little shaky, but filled with a quiet pride. "It's mine." "Well," she said, looking at the piece with clear admiration, "it's magnificent. The emotion, the movement in it, it's not just art. It's a story. A powerful one. David nodded, his gaze drifting over the people who were now discussing the painting. The words he overheard were different this time. They weren't dismissing or mocking, they were genuine, full of wonder and respect. It's like the paint has a life of its own. The colors make it feel like the world's spinning, but in a way that feels real. It was a far cry from the criticisms he had heard just days earlier. For the first time, David realized that his art had found a place where it wasn't just accepted but celebrated. His voice, his truth, had finally been heard, not just by Lily or Mrs. Harmon, but by everyone who stopped to look and think. Suddenly, he was pulled from his thoughts by a soft voice behind him. "That's incredible," Lily said, appearing beside him, her eyes wide with admiration as she gazed at the painting. "I knew it would be." David smiled at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you for speaking up. I don't think this would have happened without you." Lily shrugged, a modest grin on her face. "You're the one who did the hard work. I just gave you a little nudge." David laughed softly, his nerves settling. "Well, I'm glad you did. It feels good to finally have people see me." Before Lily could respond, a few students wandered over to the painting, and David found himself engaging in casual conversation about the meaning behind the work. He explained how the swirling reds and blacks symbolized the constant internal struggle, the fight to define himself in a world that often tried to box him in. He spoke about the gold in the center, a representation of the light he fought to hold on to, even when the world around him seemed dark. It wasn't easy for him to share his truth like this, but there was something empowering about speaking openly about his experiences. The words didn't feel like burdens anymore, they felt like pieces of himself being given the space they deserved. And as more people gathered to listen, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. A few hours into the showcase, as the crowd began to thin, David's painting was still being admired. He noticed Mr. Dawson standing across the room, talking to a group of teachers. His eyes flicked briefly toward David, and for a moment, David thought he saw something there, a flicker of realization, maybe even regret. But it was gone as quickly as it came. David didn't care. It didn't matter anymore. As the event wound down, Mrs. Harmon approached him once again, this time with a more formal tone. "David, I wanted to tell you that the school board has asked about your work. They were really impressed by it." David's eyes widened in surprise. "The school board? What do they want?" "They're considering featuring it in the district's upcoming art showcase. They think it would make a powerful statement." David's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected something like this, not in a million years. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Harmon said with a reassuring smile. "Just know that you've made an impact. And your story? It's one that needs to be told." As the night came to a close, David felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. He was no longer the invisible kid in the back of the class, hidden beneath layers of assumption and prejudice. He was standing in his truth, proud of what he had created, not just on canvas, but in himself. Later, as he walked home through the quiet streets, David reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The harsh criticisms, the isolation, the quiet moments of doubt, they had all been part of the journey, part of what had made him who he was. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly confident in that identity. When he reached his doorstep, he looked up at the night sky, taking a deep breath. There was a kind of stillness in the air, but also a promise that this was only the beginning. That his story, his art, his voice, would continue to grow, to be seen, and to be heard. And with that, David stepped inside, ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just a kid with a paintbrush anymore. He was an artist, a storyteller, and above all, he was someone who refused to be silenced. As the days passed, David's life began to take on a new rhythm. The attention from the art showcase had left an undeniable mark on him. He no longer walked the halls of school with his shoulders hunched, trying to shrink into the background. He stood a little taller now, and when he spoke, his voice carried a confidence that hadn't been there before. The art board was true to its word. His piece was chosen to be displayed at the district showcase, alongside work from other students across the region. The moment he saw his painting hanging in the brightly lit gallery was a moment he would never forget. People lingered around it, discussing it with a kind of reverence, the kind of respect he had longed for. But there was something even more powerful than the praise. It was the realization that his work had begun to spark conversations that mattered. Parents, teachers, and even other students approached him, asking about the meaning behind the painting. They saw something deeper than what had been visible at first glance. His art had become a bridge, one that connected his personal experiences with others who were willing to listen. Through these conversations, David learned that the power of art wasn't just in the brushstrokes or colors, it was in its ability to open eyes, to break down walls, and to spark change. And for the first time, he saw himself not as an outsider in this school, but as someone with a purpose, someone whose story was important enough to be told and shared. Weeks later, after the district art show, David was invited to speak at an assembly about his work and the story behind it. The auditorium was packed, and as he stepped up to the microphone, he felt that familiar tightness in his chest. But it was different now. The nerves were still there, but they were tempered with a sense of purpose. He paused for a moment, taking in the faces in the crowd. Art is how I express the parts of me that words can't always capture. And I've learned that when we don't let ourselves be defined by others, when we speak our truth through our work, whatever that work may be, we not only find ourselves, but we give others the permission to find themselves too. The room was silent, save for the soft shuffle of people in their seats. He could feel the weight of their attention, but this time, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt empowering. For once, he wasn't afraid to speak, to share the truth that had been building inside him for so long. David continued, his words flowing more easily now, the truth is, none of us are invisible. And no one should ever be made to feel like they are. We all have a story worth telling. And sometimes, the people who are the hardest to see are the ones whose stories matter the most. As he finished, the room erupted in applause. David stood there for a moment, surprised at the strength in the reaction. The affirmation was overwhelming, but it wasn't just about the applause. It was about something deeper, something more permanent. He was no longer just the misunderstood student in the back of the room. He was an artist, a storyteller, and most importantly, he was a person who had found his voice. The weeks that followed were filled with even more opportunities. His painting was featured in local galleries, and he began collaborating with other students who shared his passion for art. People from different backgrounds, with different stories, reached out to him, each one seeking to connect with the work he had done and the message it conveyed. Mr. Dawson, once the harsh critic, now made a point to speak with David after class, offering critiques and even asking for advice. David wasn't sure if it was genuine or if it was an attempt at making amends, but either way, he wasn't bitter. He had moved past that moment, past the need for validation from someone who could never truly understand his experience. He no longer needed anyone to define his worth. And as for Lily, she remained one of his closest friends, their bond solidified by the way she had stood up for him when it mattered most. Together, they worked on new projects, each one more ambitious than the last, and each one more reflective of the world they were both navigating. But more than anything, David knew that he was on a path that was his to shape. The world had tried to silence him, but now, with every brushstroke, every line, every piece of art, he was writing his own narrative. And with that, David found peace. His voice had been heard. His truth had been seen. And no one could ever take that away from him. As he stood in front of his latest work, the gallery lights casting long shadows on the canvas, David smiled to himself. The world was ready for him now. And he was ready for it.